Hey guys, and welcome to Inktober day number 7. We've made it through week 1, so here's to hoping the rest of the month goes as well as this week has. So for today's piece, I drew my inspiration from the prompt sword. And this piece is much more object-based than a lot of the pieces I've done prior to this one. I tend to draw a lot of people in my artwork, and this is sort of represented in this piece with the hand holding the sword instead of just having a standalone sword. But for the most part, the focus of this piece is the sword itself and the vines and flowers surrounding it. Now, with this piece in particular, I thought the most deeply about the composition. With a lot of the pieces I had done prior to this one, I was fairly loose with how I applied the compositional rules. I definitely tried to make sure it was aesthetically pleasing, but I wasn't really thinking technically. And I think that's okay every now and again, especially since I've had a lot of experience with composition in abstract art, and so you just get a general eye for what looks good and where it looks good. However, with this piece, I knew that the focal point was going to be the sword itself, and I wanted it to be within the frame of the composition on an angle. Now, that in and of itself added a little bit of compositional interest, but I ended up drawing vines wrapping around the sword. I added quite a bit of detail to the sword itself, and I added flower petals coming off of the roses in areas where it would draw the eye around the piece. My main reasoning for being so thoughtful about how I approached the composition of this piece was based on the fact that it's a very object-based piece. Sometimes when you have characters in an illustration, they draw your eye to them in their own right, and you don't have to worry quite so much about making it interesting. However, with this one, if I wasn't so focused on the details of the piece, if I hadn't created swirls on the sword that looked like they had been engraved, or if I hadn't added the flowers or the vines, it could have come across as very plain. And plain isn't really what I was going for with this piece. I tried to have a very specific attention to detail with the design of the sword itself. I've not really done a lot of weapon design, so I looked at a lot of references and tried to figure out the best way to create this sword. And weapon design is actually something I would be interested in looking into a little more in the future. It's just something that I don't really think about very often and don't always want to put the time into actually doing. Speaking of the attention to detail in this piece, one of my favorite bits about this illustration are the edges of the sword itself. I purposefully drew them jagged and rough, like they had been beaten up over a long period of time, and it makes it appear well used, and I really like that effect. Now, as I mentioned in yesterday's piece, I've been trying to be a little more careful about how I work with different tones in these pieces, and that's something that I realized I wasn't very good at, and I think it's interesting that the thing I'm getting out of Inktober is I need to work more on my values. And since I still have 3 weeks left in this challenge, there's plenty of time for me to experiment and grow. So for this piece, I really tried to push the values even further. I knew that I wanted the actual sword blade to be very light, and I wanted the background to be kind of a mid-tone, but for some other elements of the piece, I wanted to be very dark. And I think the vine, specifically in this piece, ends up being one of the darkest values in any of the Inktober pieces I've done thus far. It's almost black. I watered it down just the tiniest little bit, mostly so you could still see the line work, but even that is extremely subtle in the final product. And I think the fact that this is the darkest value says a lot about how comfortable I'm getting with ink as a medium, specifically in this application, using a paintbrush and water as opposed to simply pens. And honestly, the more I work with ink in this way, the more I find myself enjoying it. And I wouldn't be surprised if in the future I end up purchasing a few other colors of ink and using them in more of my day-to-day artwork. So overall, I'm very happy with the way this piece turned out. I think it looks very nice next to the rest of my Inktober pieces, and I really feel like the pieces I've created thus far tell a story. They all play with each other, and though it's not a linear story, I think they fit together like pieces of a puzzle, and ultimately that is what I came into this challenge wanting to do. Hopefully it continues in that manner, only time can tell, but I hope you guys enjoyed watching me create this piece. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow. Bye.